they're going to be looking at the idea of Americanism as it's depicted on the screen. So Quentin Crisp, who's a very famous personality, shall we say, was often quoted as saying that America was more like the movies than you'd ever imagine. So there's this idea, especially in the early part of the 20th century, when film became such a popular method of conveying daily life, that people wondered, well, how accurate is film in terms of what it's like in the United States? And the United States very quickly emerged as sort of the epicenter of filmmaking in the world. And still today, people think Hollywood, sometimes Bollywood in India, but still, the United States produces so many films every year that there's this question of how does film serve as an expression of what it means to be American? So let's just start with some framing questions, and we will take it from there. So Hollywood is viewed as something that's innately American. It's an American place and an American idea. For those of you who were here yesterday, we talked a little bit about how Hollywood came to be. So we have Thomas Edison. People said he was the man that would get us into the 20th century. But he, as part of that, as part of his technologies, insisted on having a bit of a monopoly on his inventions. So one of those was cinema. And Thomas Edison didn't really want other people muscling in on his invention, on his money-making system, and so he fought very hard against people who were trying to make films. And so the result was, if you were trying to make films in Boston, if you were trying to make films in New York, if you're trying to make films in Chicago, you would be pestered by Edison and his cronies. Although it was ruled against Edison that he couldn't monopolize the film industry because of antitrust laws in the United States, he still held a significant amount of influence because he was such a famous person. He held so many patents that it was difficult to get around him. So filmmakers went west to Hollywood, to California, and it's sort of an innately American idea of discovering something, of new frontiers, of being pioneers for this cause. And Hollywood is founded as something of an American institution, a place where people can go to make lots of money without having someone tell them they can't. What could be more American than that? So the first question is, whose America are we talking about? And racism and anti-immigration in early films becoming a very popular theme because the people making these films were white. They were white males. And so they were depicting ideas of white masculinity, usually at the expense of women, at the expense of immigrants, at the expense of minority populations in the United States. So let's start out with one of the first big epics of American film, Birth of the Nation. And still today, Birth of the Nation is considered a staple in American film. It's highly controversial because in the film, for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, the heroes are the Ku Klux Klan. So this takes place in a very agrarian South, where the pangs of Reconstruction are still being felt on a daily basis. And people have a lot of animosity towards a foreign government coming in, which they considered the Union Army to be a foreign government at this point, and telling them how they had to live. Ideas about masculinity are thrown out of whack. As the scene we're going to look at today, the state houses are now controlled by a population that was formerly enslaved, and it threatened white masculinity in a very, very insidious way for these men because they felt they were no longer in control of land that they viewed as theirs. We'll just look at a clip and take it from there. A historic incident from the first, so this is showing the state house in South Carolina. These are legislatures who've just been elected African Americans. Alright, so that's just a very few sample clips from what is an incredibly disturbing film by today's standards. But at the time, if you're looking at cultural expectations of the day, there's this theme of when the film ends, the KKK, which is an illegal terrorist organization at this point in the United States, is viewed as the heroes, the people who are coming in to reclaim the sense of pride, of law and order that's supposedly void during the Reconstruction period. If you look at the early depictions of the film, the state lawmakers are drinking on the job, they're putting their feet on the desk. There's a scene where it shows a balcony full of white men in blackface who are supposed to be African American characters who are like shooting guns and acting like prostitutes and things like that. So it's a very troubling depiction of the South. But American audiences love this film because as it showed the ending, there's like this semblance of law and order. A lynching in the scene is viewed as a form of justice, of the ability to reclaim law from the hands of tyranny. That a lot of Southerners at this point were still channeling this idea that they were the inheritors of the American invention. That the Southern United States was where the founders were from, and they were the ones who said that in the face of tyranny you have to rebel. And then this form of law and order in the form of the Klan, which is a decidedly white male organization, comes in and supposedly saves the day. And you see women in this film are always depicted as helpless. You have Lillian Gish, who is a very frail, beautiful woman, who in most films that she played, her most iconic roles, she was a victim of some non-white male exerting sexual authority over her. There's a film where she's sold into white slavery, there's Birth of a Nation. She gets this image of being the white damsel who has to be rescued by a white man, or the film ends in tragedy. And again, Birth of the Nation is considered a happy ending, because the Klan is marching down the streets. At the end, you see all these African Americans going to vote, and the Klan stops them from voting. So it sort of twists history, and what now we would consider to be really outrageous and monstrous, in this film is viewed as a positive thing. That now white people are making the laws again, and law and order has returned to the South. And it was a blockbuster. People all over the country were coming to see this film. And again, that doesn't mean it was without controversy. Many people commented on how racist this film was, how it trivialized violence against African Americans in the South, and sort of applauded attempts to suppress voting rights. President Woodrow Wilson, however, was a big fan of this film. He said that it would be written like lightning in the sky when he saw this movie. He thought it was a great statement on American film and on what it meant to be American. So even the President of the United States is publicly commenting on this film as an American masterpiece. So while today we view this as a very troubling film, you can't study American film without looking at Birth of a Nation. And we'll continue to look at this theme of the Civil War and its influence on film momentarily. However, let's look at something slightly less controversial. So Charlie Chaplin, who's a superstar of American film, a British immigrant to the United States, is starring in Gold Rush. And so Gold Rush plays into this other idea about the American frontier in this early Hollywood film, where it's a man who goes to the Klondike in search of gold during the gold rush in the 1890s. And this idea of expansionism is still relatively new, and people moving different places for new opportunities. And again, the film is played as a comedy, and he gets there and it's sort of awful. It's cold, there's no food. He and the man who he's prospecting with envision eating each other after they try to boil a shoe and eat it. So it's not all glamorous. Charlie Chaplin is ultimately a comedian. But it does play on this idea of the American frontier and the American pioneer as something that's admirable, and going to new places and claiming it as American. So let's look at this film clip and see what we have. Ironically, it's a silent movie. So in terms of American expectations, as you can see, it plays into this idea that first of all, it's very easy to get rich. All you have to do is want it bad enough. If you go somewhere, like places like California or Alaska, you can just dig around in the dirt, find a lot of gold, and immediately you've got a lot of money. So we see Charlie Chaplin in this film go from impoverished to super rich, where he's sitting around this table and these women are just fawning over him and he does some bizarre dance with bread. But it's very funny, because people also like to see this idea of you can go from rags to riches overnight. In the span of this film, you see him go from impoverished to wealthy to ultimately impoverished again, but we won't get into that. It's a comedic effect. But still, it plays into this idea that in America, you can get rich quick with no consequences, and all you have to do is want it bad enough and be willing to suffer just a little bit. Not too much, but just enough so that you know you really, really want to be wealthy. So social mobility and getting rich quick. That everyone has equal opportunities. You can rise from little to greatness as long as you are a white male. Because as we saw, if you're African American and you rise to greatness, the Klan will come in and make sure that doesn't happen, and they'll get a parade out of it. So again, early American film, very much dominated by this idea of getting wealthy in a hurry. So Al Jolson, in 1927, stars in a film called The Jazz Singer, and it's the first talkie. People originally thought this idea would never play out. They thought that talking pictures were a fad that would be over with almost immediately. However, that doesn't happen. And so you see some very popular stars from the silent film era, such as Norma Talmadge, who most people don't remember this today. But Norma Talmadge in the 1910s and 20s was the pinnacle of American stardom. Has anyone here seen Singing in the Rain? So the character Lena Lamont in Singing in the Rain is based on Norma Talmadge, the one who's like, I don't understand why no one wants to hear me talk in the pictures. Like, she doesn't have the voice to adapt to talkies, and she falls out of favor. She retires a very wealthy woman, but no one really remembers her, so this idea of stardom changes. It's no longer enough to look pretty and to be on film. Now you have to speak. You have to be someone who's relatable as a character. You're also going to see narratives playing out a little bit longer. But The Jazz Singer is very popular because it does touch on this idea of the American dream. You have Al Jolson's character, who is the son of a cantor, a Jewish religious man who runs the music program in a synagogue, who is insistent that his son also become a cantor. However, the son's dream is to become a big popular jazz singer, and he runs away from home and does it. So his mother is ultimately the one who's like, you have to live your dream. You have to go and fight for what you want. And it plays into this immigrant experience, and the idea that if you want something bad enough, you have to go and fight it. So the 20s end very abruptly. In 1929, the stock market crashes. That doesn't necessarily stop people from going to the movies. The 1930s are a renaissance for American film. Lots of pictures were made. Stars such as Olivia de Havilland, Clark Gable, Hedy Lamarr, Lauren Bacall, Claudette Colbert become very popular figures in the American public. And then you get to 1939, and it is a very revolutionary year for films, because you have two pictures that come out that sort of change the way things are happening. Gone with the Wind at the bottom, which is an American epic about the Civil War, and The Wizard of Oz. Both of these films, in addition to being filmed in color, and being very, very successful films in a year of low economic turnout, World War II is on the horizon. It's not a good time to be in America, but people are flocking to the pictures to see these films because they both have this similar theme of the homeland being the most important thing. So we'll look at a couple of clips and see how that plays out. But you have Dorothy Gale, who, The Wizard of Oz is something of a quintessential American text. People say it's an allegory about Theodore Roosevelt and the ideas of popularism. You have Theodore, Dorothy, where Dorothy Gale is supposedly a representation of Theodore Roosevelt in the early 1900s. So it's a distinctly American film. She's from Kansas, like the heartland of the United States. She's also bored out of her mind. She's experiencing this teenage angst. She just wants to go find somewhere where there isn't any trouble, as she quotes, somewhere over the rainbow. And the filmmakers do a very good job of making Kansas be something of a bleak, desolate place. There's this background that's gray and dingy, all this rusted out farm equipment. Mrs. Gulch, Margaret Hamilton's character, who rides around on the bike and terrorizes this poor girl and her dog. They all make it seem like Kansas is a really awful place to be. However, when she does end up going over the rainbow when she gets caught in a tornado and lands in the middle of Oz, her immediate thought is, well, how do I get back to Kansas? This place is so weird. It's beautiful and gorgeous and opulent and all of these beautiful colors, but the whole time, she just wants to get back home. So we'll look at what we can call a staple of the American song genre. Judy Garland, Over the Rainbow. In the heart symbol. The overall message of the story, and Judy Garland is something of an example of this American icon. Because the idea that you can become a superstar becomes popular now. Her birth name is Ethel Gum. That doesn't show up well in a picture. So she goes to Hollywood, the name changes to Judy Garland, and bada bing, bada boom. People over the United States sort of rally around this idea that you can, if you're not happy with the situation, you can totally change it. You can go to Hollywood, you can become a superstar, like Judy Garland did when she was still a teenager. And this idea of changing your identity, as happens in the film, where you feel out of place, it sort of becomes a rallying cry for the American misfit. So around this time, Judy Garland becomes the first American gay icon, where gays and lesbians across the US sort of rally around this figure as someone who goes from a sad place where she's misunderstood to this big, beautiful land. And it's a popular idea, especially in this period of the American Depression, where a lot of people really, really wish they were someplace else. And while filmmakers do indulge that somewhat, the brunt of this film takes place in Oz, where it is colorful and beautiful, but it's also very dangerous. There's a wicked witch after her. There's trees that throw apples at her. There's danger around every turn. But the film doesn't indulge this idea that escapism is necessarily the answer. They're playing into this fear that a lot of Americans have. They're living in poverty, things aren't necessarily good, another war is about to start. People don't necessarily want to be living in America at this point. The Dust Bowl, there's a reason these scenes in Kansas are shown so prominently, because people are watching on the news about the Dust Bowl and how impoverished people are in Kansas, especially, where there's dust storms all the time, farming is no longer profitable, people struggle with money. But let's look at the final scene of the film. So again, her whole message when she's in Oz is she wants to go back home to Kansas. And let's see how the film concludes, the message that you're left with.
Yes, I'm ready now. Then close your eyes and tap your hands together 3 times. There's no place like home. There's no place like home. There's no place like home. There's no place like home.
Wake up, honey.
Place like home. There's no place like home.
Dorothy, Dorothy, dear.
Is that it, darling? It's you.
Hello there, anybody home? I just dropped by because I heard the little girl got caught in the... Well, she seems all right now.
Yeah, she got quite a bump on the head. We kind of thought that for a minute she was confused.
Oh.
But I didn't leave you out of the Henry. That's just the trouble. And I tried to get back for days and days.
There, right, quiet now. You just had a bad dream.
Sure. Remember me? Your old pal Hunk? Me? Hey, Queen, you couldn't forget my face, could you?
But it wasn't a dream. It was a place. And you were there.
Oh,
But you couldn't have been, could you?
Oh, we dream lots of silly things when we...
No, Ed. This is a real, truly live place. And I remember that some of it wasn't very nice. And most of it was beautiful. But just the same, all I kept saying to everybody was, I want to go home. And they sent me home. Doesn't anybody believe me?
Of course we believe you.
Well, but anyway, told them we're home. Home. And this is my room. And you're all here. And I'm not going to leave here ever, ever again. Because I love you all. Oh, in the end, there's no place like home.
So this Depression era nostalgia tends to get the best of people. Like, when you watch this film, you sort of think that it has a happy ending until you kind of reflect on what she's saying. When she's in Oz, she sort of infamously states, if you are going looking for something and you don't find it, it was probably never further than your own backyard. This idea of staying put and toughing through it, and that home is still the best place, even if things aren't always wonderful, is pervading this film because it comes with this American sense of finding roots and settling down and being content and suffering through misfortune. That it's very popular, especially in this Depression era film. And it's important to note how the Depression influenced American film because so many great American films were born out of the Depression because people needed some means of escape. That's why everyone paid the money to go see the films. Gone with the Wind comes in a similar sort of mentality. The difference is Scarlett O'Hara emerges as a Southern woman who is a Confederate. And this is at a point where it's not necessarily popular to sympathize with the former Confederacy. However, she's designed to be a deliberately non-Confederate character. When the war ravages her homeland, as we'll see in just a second, she infamously states she'll never go hungry again. It's a very empowering scene. And the Reconstruction period in the United States is presented on film to mirror the Depression. Formerly wealthy people are now impoverished. They're having to go out and pick cotton with their own hands. They're struggling with money. But yet Scarlett O'Hara is able to maintain this American survivalism that in the Depression people thought was so excellent, and it's what made this film as popular as it was. Because Americans who were struggling with money and struggling to make ends meet could identify with this protagonist who had once had a lot of things, born into a lot of privilege, but now was responsible for ensuring the survival of her family in a time of very serious economic hardship. So let's look at this two famous scenes from the film.
God, my witnesses, I'm going to live
film where the protagonist, played by Vivian Lee, is standing with her father, and they're overlooking all of the land that they own. And it's sort of the same thing where you have their silhouettes with the sun going down in the background, the same music is playing. And here where we see this burnt out tree and this pitiful little fence, you see these lush green hills, their big house, she's wearing a big fancy hoop skirt, he's just finished writing. And you go from that at the beginning of the film to this is the end of the first half. After this comes the intermission, because the film is 4 hours, and who could sit through 4 hours of a movie all at once? So this is the last thing people have on their mind as they go into intermission. This woman who you see her life go from having everything to literally having nothing. She comes home from living in Atlanta during the war. The house is still standing. Her mother has died of typhoid fever. Both of her sisters are sick. Her sister-in-law Melanie has just had a baby that they don't have any food for. Her father's gone mentally insane. She's the one now who has to run the family, has to run the farm, has to ensure their survival. And she's willing to do that. And she's willing to do that by means that are not always scrupulous by the standards of the South. So in the second part of this film, she marries her sister's boyfriend who owns a lumber mill and becomes this lumber magnate in Atlanta. She makes